Good afternoon, and good morning, and good evening to those joining us, and a happy Human Rights Day to everyone. And I think today, being Human Rights Day, is no better context than to be talking about displaced people in cities whose human rights are often compromised as they move and try to settle in new locations. And I'd like to thank Cities Alliance for this opportunity and for the partnership that we have in this series of Urban Thinkers campuses. And this is the third session of a series on forced displacement to cities, focusing particularly on bridging the gap between humanitarian and development actions in migration and displacement contexts. So this is the final session of it. Sadly, we heard yesterday that one of our speakers, Ms. Nestorine Sangari, who is a former Minister of Women and Social Action in Burkina Faso, is in hospital, and she won't be able to join the session. So we wish her the best, and we wish her a speedy recovery. And I think we do have a video from Burkina Faso that we hope to find a moment to show later on in the day. We've got a great bunch of speakers today, and I'm really honored to be here moderating this session. And I'll introduce them shortly. But before I do, I might just share one or two perspectives from UN Habitat's point of view relating to displacement in cities. Habitat, as you probably know, has a specific mandate to work in urban areas and to support government authorities at all levels in advancing sustainable urban development. We also find that IDPs, and there seems to be greater and greater numbers of IDPs due to climate change and due to conflict and other issues which are forcing people to move. And more often than not, they tend to be moving to cities. And frequently, mayors are not prepared for this rapid influx of people. And many IDPs live in inadequate living conditions, and they face risks due to insecure tenure rights, lack of access to basic services, including water, sanitation, health, education services. Many of them are also socially excluded, and there's often a little political will for their inclusion. And this is not really a temporary situation. We find that, indeed, more often than not, displacement is a protracted issue. And so it requires both humanitarian support, but it also requires development support. So while humanitarian aid can help bring immediate support, there is a need to advance development approaches. And I think over the last few years, there's been a real effort to understand how to link the humanitarian work to development work, or vice versa. I may just quickly ask, actually, for people to switch off their microphones because we're getting some interruptions. So if you could please do that, that would be great. As we in UN Habitat have been exploring this issue, and as we are responding more and more to demands from cities for support in responding to displacement issues, there are just a few things that we really see as frequent trends. First, and important perspectives. First, the IDPs need to be understood as citizens and rights holders who can actually support economic and social development of the city. And it's important to understand who IDPs are and their rights. We also find that mayors and local authorities are the main actors in dealing with responses to displacement. And they need to be enabled, they need to be empowered and supported to act. They're the face of government, both to the host community, but also to IDPs. And they need empowerment and often support. And they need to be central in the decision-making process. We also find that in urban areas, cross-sectoral coordination, area-based responses tends to be an important approach. Quite often, humanitarian support is delivered in a very sort of sectoral way, but we also understand the way that cities work, the urban fabric works in a multi-sectoral way. And understanding this is quite important for humanitarian and development actors, and to really start with what the city's got and build on it. So there's often not a one clear solution, but understanding the city and understanding communities is a very important entry point to supporting durable solutions for displacement in cities. Lastly, there's a huge need for evidence base. And really, when we're looking at cities, it's not just the statistical data that we need, but really area-based, cross-sectoral, spatial data to understand the impacts of the movement of people, the functionality of services, the functionality of support actors, etc. And this needs to be very kind of a granular approach. So investing in understanding the city is key to really providing good solutions. We work in many different countries in this area, particularly Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Iraq, Mozambique, Somalia, Sudan, etc. And now we're expanding our work, particularly recently in West Africa, such as in Burkina Faso. And what's key, I mean, UN Habitat is an urban agency, and so our work tends to be undertaken quite a lot in partnership with people like IOM, UNHCR, UNICEF, UNDP, etc., as a member of country teams. So the Urban Thinkers Campus today provides us an opportunity to really increase that visibility of urban displacement, including to build on the conversations that we've had in the previous two sessions, but also to be starting to look at, what are the sort of policy positions and what are the practical experiences that we've learned. We have a fantastic panel, which I'm pleased to introduce. We'll start with Scott Lloyd from IDMC, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, and he will provide hopefully an overview of some of the data on global data on IDPs and their movement to cities. We'll then be hearing from Greta Zinda, and she is in the Secretariat of the Secretary General's panel, high-level panel on internal displacement. And between that and over the last year and until next April, they're developing a global policy position on displacement, and this is a very exciting process, so we look forward to hearing from that. So, and then we go from global right down to local, and we look forward to hearing from Mohammed Sirajul Islam, who is the Chief Urban Planner in Dakar South, to understand how did that city deal with displacement and what are the innovative and important lessons we can learn from there. And then we move then from city level to regional level and hear from Iberia Lopez on some of the experiences of Asia Pacific. After a short time for comments and questions, etc., I'm pleased then to be introducing Isis Nunes Ferreira, who works with the Joint IDP Profiling Service, and she'll be looking particularly at how we can profile urban areas and how we can understand the relationship between the urban fabric and displacement, and some of the tools we've been developed by GIPS in that regard. And then we move to Iraq, where we hear from my colleague Muslim Kazimi about how we're able to support housing, land, property rights of IDPs in cities, which is absolutely key as a first step towards realization of basic rights and supporting longer-term durable solutions. And finally, we'll be hearing from Mr. Evan Calabria of Oxford University, looking particularly at displacement in Uganda and Ethiopia. So I hope you enjoy this session. We have a range of locations, we have a range of kind of global and local issues to be talking about. We have a range of practitioners and agencies, support agencies, and really from this discussion we hope to have to arrive at some important sort of policy kind of recommendations, and hopefully this might even feed some of the discussion happening for the high-level panel on internal displacement. So without any further introduction, I'm pleased to hand the floor over to Scott Lloyd. You have 10 minutes, and Scott is leading IDMC's Urban Internal Displacement Program. Over to you, Scott.
Thank you, David, and hello to everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to share some of this work here. I would have to first up disappoint you all for not having a definitive.
Scott, I believe you are muted.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, thank you, David, for the introduction. I'll just repeat what I just said to myself. It's a pleasure to be here, and what I'm going to do today is try and explain a little bit more about what IDMC do and some of the goals we have to find out how we can better report on urban displacement at a global level. I'm sorry to disappoint you. I'm not going to be able to give you a figure or a definitive answer on the amounts or of IDPs moving to urban areas or between urban areas. It's something which is quite contentious. We know that the figure moves around the humanitarian sector quite often. It's 70 to 80%, but we really cannot verify any of that. So it's a work in progress. We think it's very important, and our mandate is to try to find out more about these numbers and to report back to our partners here who can use that as a solid evidence base and start building some more informed policy. Next slide, please. So what we do is monitor internal displacement at a global level. We do this on a daily basis. We have a team who collects data from our partners, UN agencies, government partners, research institutions, local NGOs. We bring that data together, we verify it, we triangulate it, and then we report on that on a yearly rhythm in the global report on internal displacement. And this tries to provide a consistent way of showing how internal displacement is affecting these different countries through either disaster, through conflict, or through development projects. Next slide, please. It was around about 2018, a little bit earlier. And we've been doing this for about 20 years, monitoring on internal displacement. That was around about 2018, where the idea that we should be looking a little bit more deeper into some of the locations of this displacement. We were hearing a lot from various agencies about how internal displacement was becoming an increasingly protracted issue, increasingly urban issue. We started to put this together in a research agenda, and now we're starting to look at internal displacement between cities, also internal displacement coming to cities, but also internal displacement between cities as well. We think that this here is a way to try to understand internal displacement, not necessarily just as what we imagine it's just from an event into an urban area, and that's where the difficulties happen, but also this ties in displacement risk and also then risk for and development conversations. Now, it's difficult, of course, as I said before, to get good data on internal displacement. Those who move into urban areas generally remain anonymous. They want to start to rebuild their lives after a displacement event as soon as possible. They're trying to integrate themselves into these new urban environments, and we're trying to find out if that narrative of internal displacement in urban areas is just how does it work with general ideas of urbanization, and what are the real vulnerabilities that internal displaced people find in these urban areas. Next slide, please. So what we do know, and I think we all, as urban people working in the urban field, we understand that rapid urbanization over the last 50 years or so has created dynamic and highly prosperous cities, but at the same time has increased the vulnerability of certain parts of the majority of developing cities. We have unplanned ad hoc development, which increases the risk of further displacement. What we do know from IDPs moving into urban areas, they tend to settle in these type of environments, which puts them again at a risk of secondary displacement. And the more vulnerable one becomes after repeated displacements, is something that really has to be addressed very early. So we're looking then at combining this conversation about displacement in urban areas with, of course, then having cities which are enabled to be able to integrate those IDPs, but also then to build resilience or allow the opportunity for IDPs also contribute to that resilience. We have here some preliminary data from our global risk model, which looks at flooding in urban areas, and as a foresight to displacement in urban areas, to come up with a figure of some 80% of displacement which happens due to flooding will most likely happen in urban areas. So we can actually address, for example, displacement or flooding risk in urban areas. We can drastically tackle the idea of internal displacement at a global level by something like 40%. So it's something which has a priority, a direct relationship to development, and something which is we've identified as a priority issue. Next slide, please. What we have done in the field is taken data which we get, and we can only report on the data that we have available to us. We don't collect the data ourselves. As I said, we have the relationships with our partners. When we do have disaggregated data or geolocated data, we can put this data over the top of the Global Human Settlements Layer, EU program on classifying urban and non-urban areas. And we can find how many IDPs are actually in urban areas at the time we got the data. So of the 55 countries which have given us conflict-related data on displacement, half of those, roughly, have geolocated data, and roughly half of those displacement cases were in urban areas. But it's a very small sample. We're looking at a global phenomena, but it's a start to try and figure out, to do more deeper into what this really means. And of course, these issues of what is urban start to come up. What is an urban condition? Can you have living in an urban condition or have access to urban systems outside of a city or outside of an urban area? Probably yes. It's something we have to also then define in our methodology, and hopefully we can do that together with our partners, so we can at least be talking about the same language. Next slide, please. Some of the work we've been doing recently is to look at not only just the data as statistics, as David pointed out earlier on. We're looking at collecting data, anonymized data from social media companies or from mobile phone utility agencies. So we have now an idea of location and an idea of time. So during the displacement event, we can track anonymously how people move due to an event, a displacement event, in a city or from outside of the city, and try to find out where that works with where people are going, how long they're being displaced for, and how they're then resettling, and what the recovery looks like in these urban areas. It also starts to tie in what we'd like to consider the continuum, urban continuum. It's not just at the middle of the city or the periphery we're looking at, it's actually the mobility and how displacement and human mobility actually work together. Next slide, please. So just to summarize, we're looking at finding out how the idea of the urban can be better defined, and we want to do that by researching more on cases of urbanization, looking more at the research on the field work which our partners are doing, trying to find out what is this urban experience and how can our data help provide the evidence to have really informed policy on displacement in urban areas. The data gap, of course, is something where we have a mandate, and we're really interested in filling, using different technologies, using different ways of triangulating, increasing our partnerships for data collection, and looking at spatial and temporal data, because things can be related to each other when you have spatial information, like what is displacement situation in an urban area, and what is it relating to in an urban area. It's also very important to find out the vulnerabilities. And then we're looking at the idea that when we report on a displacement case, we can close that case out by saying it is a durable solution. And this is, of course, also incredibly difficult to define, but we do hope that a fit-for-purpose model could be suggested where in an urban area, in the right environment, perhaps that is some form of a solution. But we're working on that as well. But what's also very important and also very encouraging is that we're seeing a lot of local authorities and also community groups who are coming together using open source technologies on monitoring and analyzing displacement, but also displacement risk. I think that's there's a lot of new ways of doing that, and we're very encouraged by that. And I think it's something to monitor further. And in the end, all this work, especially the localized work, is counteracting our global picture on internal displacement, so we can actually try and get really informed local policy, and that's dealing with things like customary land and different tenure arrangements, different ways of how people actually establish their new lives in urban areas. So it's quite a mixed bag. We're looking at the global picture, but we know the global picture is only one perspective, and that's basically a work in progress, and we'd definitely like to come back and present some more of the data and more evidence in this as we go along. So I'm looking forward to hearing the rest of the presentation on this thing. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Scott. That's excellent. And really, there are some very important data gaps that needs to be addressed, and even the question of what is urban and when are durable solutions reached, because we see constantly the numbers going up and up. I've been working in Somalia recently, but do we ever sort of close and say, well, actually these people have reached durable solutions, and what are the metrics used for this? So I think there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done in this understanding IDP data, and thank you so much for what you've shared. And going from data to policy, and this is exactly why we need data to inform policy. I'm pleased to introduce Greta Zander now, who is the head of research and outcomes at the Secretariat of the Secretary General's high-level panel on internal displacement. Welcome, Greta. And it would be great you're on such an exciting journey right now, listening to cities, listening to IDPs, listening to practitioners, and working with the panel and putting together some global policy positions. And we'd love to just hear from you, your perspectives, and what this journey is telling you about IDPs in cities. Over to you, Greta. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. I'm delighted to be here. So indeed, today I will tell you a little bit more about the panel and initial reflections that it has had, and I had the chance to see as well. Next slide. So first, the panel. The Secretary General chose 8 eminent persons last year to be part of a panel on internal displacement, that is to look at what could be done to improve the situation of IDPs, but also to prevent solutions and to support solutions to prevent displacement and to support solutions to displacement. So the panel has to give its recommendations to the Secretary General by September 2021. And just to give you a sense of who is on the panel, we have current and former ministers, we have people working in the private sector, former heads of the African Development Bank, as well as members of civil society. And what is also, I think, quite unique and exciting about this panel is that half of the members actually are in countries which experience internal displacement. So that is Afghanistan, Colombia, South Sudan, and Ethiopia. What I can say also, what is quite interesting is, as part of the terms of reference of the panel, the panel members have been know that it is really important to look at the new urban agenda for IDPs, that it is quite significant. And they also ask to dialogue with a range of stakeholders, but including municipal authorities and other local actors. So this is very much part of their mandate. Next slide. So since it started its work in February this year, the panel has heard from a range of actors through different methods. One is to receive submissions, formal submissions by different actors, whether it's governments, including many governments with IDPs, but also UN agencies, NGOs, academics. And so far, it has received over 90 submissions that it has analyzed. And the submissions are about explaining the problems, but also supporting, proposing ways for solution to the panel. The panel has also had some 50 bilateral discussions and also thematic discussions. It has undertaken research and is continuing to do so, and it has also received research for partners. And also what is really unique, I think, is thanks to UN agencies and NGOs which have done this on its behalf, the panel has been able to hear from 12,500 IDPs in conflict settings, including in urban areas, but also in disaster areas, in 22 countries. And that's been really, really important. And here is what they've heard when it comes to the specific issue of urban setting. What is interesting is that although this is not a statistically relevant sample, we can say that almost half of the IDPs who've been consulted have said that local integration is something they really think is as important or even more important than return. They really consider local integration as a solution, particularly for those in urban areas. So for sure, this has also implications when it comes to recommendations that the panel will make. When it comes to the priorities of the panel, so the panel is really looking at a range of issues, really focusing on solutions, but it has highlighted the issue of political will, of the importance of incentivizing political will, both of national actors, but also of local actors, as a way to really make progress on internal displacement, from prevention to solutions. So this is really the main focus of the panel. In addition to receiving all this research and example and recommendations, the panel is really interested to interact directly with mayors, with other local actors. And I just want to illustrate here that through a partnership with Cities Alliance, the panel has had a chance to really deep dive in the situation of IDPs in Adama in Ethiopia. And it's been an extremely rich example for them because they've been able to understand better what are the challenges, but also some of the solutions which have been found to actually integrate IDPs. And I also want to just recognize here Dr. Evan Easton Calabria, who's part of this panel and who was also part of this process. Next slide. In addition to all these examples, I just wanted to give you kind of a selection of situations that we've been looking at and that I'm also personally familiar with to give a sense of what we see when it comes to IDPs and municipal authorities. The first example I wanted to show you is the one in Myitkyina in Kachin State in Myanmar. And this is a situation, and you can see this is a flood. But what is really interesting in this situation is that, and also very, very challenging, is that there's many conflict-induced IDPs who also live in Myitkyina. So municipal authorities, when they were faced with this flood, they had to see how to ensure the evacuation of the local population, but also of conflict-induced IDPs, also how to work with other local partners, not just municipal authorities, and also when it came to return, to ensure that they could have good rehabilitation of houses. And what was really interesting, I think, in this example is that the Catholic Church has had a very strong role when it comes to supporting conflict-induced IDPs, and also when it comes to flooding. Actually, they've also helped a lot, and many IDPs found refuge in monasteries. So I think this illustrates well also the type of actors that municipal authorities work with when it comes to this type of situation. Next. Another example that we got to study and that I had the opportunity to see was in eastern Ukraine in the city of Mariupol. So when the conflict erupted some years ago, which led to many people fleeing from eastern Ukraine, what happened is that municipal authorities in Mariupol were it was very new for them. They had never experienced internal displacement before. And all of a sudden, it was the end of the summer, and they had to come up with how do we actually reintegrate all these children who arrived, how to provide them education, how can we actually provide support to livelihoods, social safety nets to people. And I think what was really interesting at the time, what we got to see, is that many university students and other volunteers actually stepped up and supported municipal authorities to organize the support to IDPs. So again, another interesting example of multi-partner response. And also international agencies came in, but they were actually a bit behind compared to all these volunteers, I think. Next slide, please. A final example I wanted to give you is the one I saw in Soacha, which is in the outskirts of Bogota in Colombia. And this is to illustrate more the issue of longer-term integration, because when we got to speak with the municipal authorities, including the mayors, it was very clear for them that IDPs, most of them were not going to return in very remote areas of the country, but rather were looking to integrate in Soacha. And there were, again, a range of issues here. You know, how do we ensure that actually people who live quite in very unsecure areas at the same time can stay there, can have access to municipal services? What about regularizing land? What about including them in disaster prevention systems? So it was very, very challenging, and I think it still is. But municipal authorities actually found creative partnerships also with the private sector to make sure that IDPs got access at least to electricity. You can see here they don't have access to water, but this is also something they were working on at the time. So this is just to illustrate the range of problems and issues that different municipal authorities may face. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. So finally, just to give you a few initial reactions from what the panel has seen. I mean, the journey is still long because the panel thankfully still has quite a few months to devise its recommendations. But through all the submissions, through all the examples that it has studied and all the discussions that it has had, things are already quite clear. And I think it also resonates with what you mentioned already, David, and what we heard also from our colleague at IDMC, is that cities really are at the forefront. And as you were saying, I think, David, are really the face of the government when it comes to responding to internal displacement. But cities can also lead the way to actually find responses and practical solutions to internal displacement. What I thought was interesting in the work we've done is that, yes, it is about the nexus, as this session is very much about the humanitarian development nexus. So we see, of course, the importance of immediate assistance, protection, which is humanitarian, also the importance of measures for longer-term integration, livelihood, access to market or credit, where the private sector, development actors are really so important. But we really kind of see the peace aspect of the nexus, because this issue for local integration to work, you really need to work on social cohesion between IDPs and host communities. We also have this issue of ensuring that IDPs are able to exercise their rights as effective citizens. And an example which we saw in what I showed you in Mariupol in Ukraine was that for a long time IDPs could not vote at the local level, which really disenfranchised them. So kind of this peace part of the nexus, if we can use that shorthand, is also quite important. So the panel is looking to refine its recommendations, but it's already very clear that it needs really, that cities need the resources, which actually reflects all this influx of people. Very often they don't have those resources. They need the data and evidence to plan, as Scott already highlighted. And when it comes to international actors, we really see the value of actors who connect really to urban systems directly rather than replacing it. Or work in parallel. And finally, this importance for mayors to be able to draw on lessons from others when it comes to internal displacement, because as we see, many actually face this issue. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Greta. This is fantastic experience that you've had actually of being able to move around and see these experiences firsthand. And despite COVID and the limitations, I think there's some real richness in this work. And in particular, we find that, I mean, you touched on the issue of access to services, and quite often IDPs end up living in informal settlements where the host community have also struggled to get access to services. And I think where IDPs arrive in cities can also have an impact on their rights and entitlements. And so thanks for this great work, and we wish you the very best in this journey. And we want to continue to support rights along this journey as well. And so we're now moving from this fantastic global perspective now to a local perspective. And I'm really pleased to introduce Mohammed Sirajul Islam, who is the Chief Urban Planner in Dhaka South, and he's going to talk about some specific solutions that were developed there. So over to you, Mohammed.
Thank you very much. My name is Mohammed Sirajul Islam. I'm Chief Urban Planner, Dhaka South City Corporation, Bangladesh. I am working for 24 years in Dhaka South City Corporation. So that internal displacement is very wide in Dhaka. I can share some slides and information about the internal displacement in urban settings. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, the main challenges faced our city, that is displaced by the climate change. And so that previous slide. That every day another 2,000 people move to Dhaka. That is, majority of them are climate migrants. Climate migrants come to Dhaka from rural to or coastal areas, driven by the actual impacts of sea level rise, flood, drought, soil erosion, cyclone, salinity, etc. It causes rapid, chaotic urbanization in Dhaka. During the rainy season, more than 1/5 of the country is flooded at once, and this year flood lasts long time. Over the last decade, nearly 700,000 Bangladeshis were displaced on average each year by natural disasters, mainly cyclones and tropical storms. According to current projection, climate change impacts will displace an estimated 1 in every 7 people in Bangladesh by 2050, with sea level rise displacing a potential 15 million people. Next slide, please. So, main challenges we face is that population density. Many journey to the capital city in search of economic opportunity, often setting in Dhaka South, because Dhaka South is one of the, say, port area, river area, and say people comes from the south part and often settle in Dhaka South. Population is more than 8.9 million in Dhaka South. That is a settled population. There is a moving, more than 2 million is a moving population also. And density is 47,500 people per square kilometer. In some areas, population is higher than that figure. And this population density is increasing high, and density is highest in the world. So, livelihood of the climate migrants becoming worse. Most are arriving in urban slums, particularly in Dhaka, one of the world's fastest growing and most densely populated megacities. Climate refugees live in slums and work in brick factories, drive rickshaws, street vendors, house cleaning, and other informal jobs. Next slide, please. So, they are the most vulnerable people in the city. And climate migrants are most vulnerable. New arrivals to Dhaka face immediate problems like shelter, food, safe drinking water, hygiene, sanitation facilities, healthcare, and others. Climate migrants often live in slum areas with limited infrastructure, poor accessibility, and high environmental risk. They face extreme poverty, public health hazard, security risks such as human trafficking. And on the environmental issue, key environmental concerns for the cities including air quality, both indoor and outdoors, surface water contamination, a reduction in groundwater, inadequate solid waste and sewage management, waterlogging, transport congestion, and the expansion of slums and squatter settlement. Disproportionate vulnerability of climate risks such as flooding, air pollution, and urban heat, and many others. Next slide, please. So that city has some initiatives. So as a Dhaka South City Corporation, we had made a temporary climate refugee center. It is a unique center that climate refugee can come and get the adaptation to the cities. And Dhaka South City Corporation has operationalized a number of departments like urban planning, climate change, environmental department, disaster management, slum improvement, and social effort to combat the climate-related adversities and social well-being in the command areas of Dhaka South. Dhaka South City Corporation recently developed a city-funded shelter dedicated to the climate refugees. This is the first ever climate refugee shelter center in Dhaka, Bangladesh. It is constructed by Dhaka South City Corporation. This shelter center is a 6-story building around 84,000 square feet. In this center, we provide different services, more than 1,000 people per day by a local NGO. In the ground floor, we deliver primary and emergency healthcare services. And the first floor, we deliver daycare and elderly people with other services. The second floor, we deliver daycare and for 2 to 10 years children, primarily developed activities, education, nutrition, and other facilities. The third floor, that is night sleeping facilities, around 500 helpless women, develop livelihood and vocational training, physiological assistance, also provides for them underdeveloped pupil. A disabled-friendly modern public toilet and lactation room also situated near the center. In the other floors, library, computer room, gymnasium, green lawn, kitchen for beneficiaries, locker room, change room, and other facilities in this center. Only a temporary provision of housing and services. It serves to welcome the migrants, easing them translation into the life of Dhaka, and limited this population exposure to climate and security-related hazards. Next slide, please. So the challenges is like that because the one climate shelter center is not sufficient for the climate migrants. That we have limited capacities to the overall need and rapid growth of climate migrants. To meet their basic needs, lack of proper food or healthy accommodation and medical care, that is inadequate for all the climate migrants. That also educational level and income disruption of these other climate migrants also. Migrants have limited knowledge about the risks and hazards of the destination, that is climate hazard and other socio-cultural hazards. Both direct and indirect impacts on micro and macro level economics. Increased rate of migration creates pressure on already rapidly urbanized areas. As climate change challenges our ongoing development, we need to address the same as the earliest and invest new and additional funds to combat the effect of climate change on our people. Next slide, please. Next slide. What is lesson we learn from this climate migrants? That we need adaptation strategy, need to take a step to shift migrants' people to the areas of migrants' origin. That can be possible by other government initiatives. Migrants fleeing climate disaster are often forced to live in informal settlements or other unhealthy conditions. Understanding where migrants are sitting through special and need assessments can help shape including policy initiatives. Continuous population growth not only add pressure to a city's existing infrastructure and systems, but if not anticipated and managed through inclusive action, can also introduce more people to climate risks and vulnerable conditions, and has inequity. Local inclusive climate initiatives can mitigate the impact of climate-induced hazards on vulnerable populations and strengthen the city's resilience. Climate migration and adaptation action that are inclusive of and invest in migrants and refugees population can facilitate their integration and provide greater economic opportunity. And then the neighboring cities like Tongi and Gazipur and other cities often migration hotspots have a role to play. Investment into a city's infrastructure, job, public systems, and more can inspire economic development in secondary cities, while reducing the impact and stresses of climate migrants on megacities. Next slide, please. And after that lesson learned, I want to show a short video, 1 minute video. Please, you can upload the video. I am requesting to upload the video of the Climate Shelter Center.
The video is coming. We just need a second to upload it. It's coming.
Thank you so much for seeing this video.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. That was a fantastic presentation, and it's very interesting to see how you're able to provide immediate solutions in an urban context by the shelter, the 6-story shelter. But it was also really good to hear your perspectives on what could provide longer-term solutions. And I think we completely agree that there is need for better access to infrastructure financing so that cities can accommodate the movement of people. But also, I think you made a very important point about secondary cities or intermediary cities. And it will be interesting to understand more, and this is where experts with data could probably start exploring whether investment in secondary cities could take some of the pressure off the major cities, which seem to attract the majority of displaced people. So thanks so much for this, and I think this gives us very important sort of policy food for thought and areas for further research. So thank you very much for this. So we now, while still in Asia, in Asia Pacific, we have Ibere Lopez of IOM, who is at the regional office there, and we're looking forward to hearing your perspectives on at the regional level about displacement in cities. So over to you, Ibere. Thank you.
And if can you hear me well?
Yes, go ahead.
All right, thank you for the introduction. I just need to do a slight rectification. I'm not in the Asia Pacific regional office. I'm actually the Housing, Land and Property Advisor to the Global Shelter Cluster. And so what I'm going to speak today, that's okay. What I'm going to speak today relates to HOP work in humanitarian settings and how a few of the conundrums that we find when we do this type of work of housing and property in humanitarian settings, and that speaks to the whole tensions between humanitarian work and development. So I'm going to draw from this experience supporting the different shelter clusters in different countries and emergencies, and then draw a parallel with the theme of the discussion today, is displacement and cities. So, for example, in Nigeria, I need to share my presentation.
Ibere, I believe I've shared with you the presentation presenter rights. Are you able to share?
Let me see here.
Yep, we are able to. Yep.
Okay, very good. All right, so for example, in Nigeria, Northeast Nigeria, Boko Haram and other armed groups attack villagers in remote and not remote areas, forcing hundreds to seek refuge in the nearest town. Many don't know what happened to the house and the lands that they left behind. Some of the affected end up in Maiduguri, the main city in Borno State. There they occupy temporary shelters, but don't know if they'll be allowed to stay there and for how long. Most would like to return, as long as some conditions are in place, that it's safe, that it's safe now and it's safe in the foreseeable future, that they have a roof over their heads, and that they still have land to cultivate or land on which to rebuild their home if the home has been destroyed. In Ethiopia, around the border of Oromia, ethnic conflict along the state's borders forced the displacement of hundreds of thousands. Many end up in host communities, housed by family and friends. They hear that their houses back where they came from are being occupied and sold. Some don't want to return, but the village where they sought refuge doesn't allow them to own land. So the local authorities there refuse to grant them rights to property in the place of refuge. And similar situations can be found in many other places, in South Sudan, DRC, Cox's Bazar, in Syria and Mozambique. Now, we know that addressing land and property issues is key to promoting return. It's key to building peace, because land is very often one of the main drivers of conflict, and is key to enabling self-reliance. So when people have tenure security, when they know that they can stay where they are, they have the capacity to think about the future, where they are, and make plans and invest in the lands, enroll the kids in school, look for a job, start building their networks. So having tenure security and knowing that you're going to be able to stay where you are enables you to rely on yourself and to rebuild your life. So we know all that. So the question is, how do we do that in a humanitarian context? Because, so for example, in conflicts, conflict usually has this ebbs and flows. So there's a ramp up of the conflict. When the conflict is ramping up, as it ramps up, the value of land goes down, and people flee. At the height of the conflict, the land where the conflict happens has no value because no one wants to stay there. And as the conflict starts to subside, people start to thinking about returning. That's when the value of land starts to increase again, because of the expectation that there will be stability, the expectation there will be peace. And that's the crucial time where we need to look at the land and property issues, because you're going to have perpetrators, armed groups occupying land because they see that the value is going to increase. You have also the displaced persons starting to consider a return because they see that the conflict is subsiding, so they see the stability, the possibility of return. So they're also thinking about return. And so this is a crucial moment to think about land and property, and that's within the humanitarian action window. But traditionally, when you think of humanitarian relief, it's usually understood as an exceptional and temporary emergency measure to save lives and alleviate the suffering of people in conflict and disasters and other crises. And humanitarian action is also supposed to be neutral, right? Assistance needs to be delivered without favoring political factions, ethnic or religious groups, and at arm's length from state power. Usually, frequently, state is part of the conflict. But HLP is, or housing, land and property, involves dealing with property rights. So it involves long-lasting records and not temporary, and involves dealing with the state, involves state information that is sanctioned by the state. So we can't be at arm's length of the state, and therefore it's non-neutral. So how do you conduct housing and property interventions? How do you address the housing and property issues during the humanitarian crisis? And this criticism or this conundrum is also familiar to people that think about the nexus, because also when you think about nexus and coordinating development work with humanitarian work, we also have the risk of being non-neutral, because in development work you usually have to work with the state. So you have the same conundrum with housing and property. Now, how do you do it? So the view for humanitarian actors, in my opinion, is to think of the concept of tenure instead of ownership. Also work with the notion that prison tenure is always incremental. It's not definitive and it's not absolute. And also accepting the idea of risk, that there will always be a risk. We will never be 100% certain that we know who owns which piece of land. So that said, how do you do that? So one of the interventions that can be done in humanitarian context and doesn't depend on the state is recording possession, recording occupancy. So the mere recordation of who lives where is already increasing tenure security by increasing and documenting that information. Also gathering available records, not in a state-sanctioned process, but just recording and gathering them informally. Working with multiple and informal sources, neighbors, elders, members of the community, people that know the history of the occupancy in the community. Mapping exercises, so mapping out the community, finding out who lives where, and put that on a map. Providing addresses as well also increases the certainty that people will not be evicted, and all that. So that's my final point to connect to the initial reflection, is that by taking all these actions that I mentioned, recording possession, gathering tenure information from multiple sources, mapping neighborhoods, we already increase security of tenure. But if on top of that, we also ensure that these records and processes are compatible with official protocols, then you open the possibility that in the future we will obtain state validation of those records and that information that you gathered. And that's where you can integrate all this effort and all this information gathering and this increasing of the security into the existing protocols, formal protocols that you have in cities and municipalities, etc. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Iberia. And I think this illustrates why it's so important that we're working in a kind of a nexus arrangement. I think if we have to be thinking about these land rights, these tenure issues at early stages, because as you mentioned, straight after the conflict, this is when there's a huge competition for property, and there's so much we have to do at very early stages to start understanding mapping and land and property rights issues. But also I think there's an element of urban planning that needs to be done, particularly when displaced people are moving and integrating. And I was quite encouraged when I went to Legatafo in Ethiopia a couple of years ago, where the mayor, even though it was a kind of a temporary-ish camp in an urban setting, she was ensuring that people had the minimum standards property demarcation. So if in the future they stayed, it was possible for them to be able to incrementally get tenure security. So it was quite an interesting perspective right from the start, even though the expectation was that people would return. She was having the foresight to be thinking that they need to create the ground in case they needed to have longer-term property rights. So thank you for this. It's an incredibly interesting topic. And we have a few minutes now where we can, people in the room can ask questions or comments to any of the presenters so far. So if you just put your hand up if you've got a question, I'll sort of scan down the attendee list to see if I can find it. So the floor is open for a few minutes. And also just to mention that there is a chat function, so you can be asking questions to the speakers as they speak, and then they can respond also using that chat function. So the floor is open. I might just to break the ice then, just ask a question there to Bere. To what extent do you think that the humanitarian community is understanding this need to look at housing, land, property rights, even while they're busy implementing humanitarian support?
That's a good question. I think it's the understanding is growing. 10 years ago, it was a new thing in humanitarian work, and the actors and also the donors needed to be convinced to integrate housing and property concerns into the programming. But nowadays, more or less everyone knows. Everyone that works in humanitarian context knows HLP, knows the acronym, and knows that there's an area of concern there at least. We still see a lot of proposals and programming that do not integrate those concerns. So we still see that a lot. But there's a growing understanding, and I think there's a growing understanding also from the donor side, and that's what's going to eventually push, I think, the actors to start doing more of this integration.
So thanks for that, and I think this is very encouraging, and I believe having it there within the protection cluster has really helped to bring that angle into the humanitarian work. So congratulations on this change of perspective on the humanitarian communities, which is very good. I don't see anybody with their hand up. In case I've missed you and you want to talk, why don't you just switch your mic off and introduce yourself? I'll just keep it open for a few more minutes, or a minute.
David, I put a question in the chat also for Greta, because based on the extensive discussions the Secretariat had with the IDPs, and based on the fact that you just said that many of them feel that local integration is so important, what other challenges did the IDPs also mention in those discussions? I think the land perspective is very important. Thanks, Ibera, for that one. And we'll hear more about from that also from Muslim in a specific country example from Iraq. But Greta, maybe over to you. What other challenges did they mainly mention?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. So these consultations, which were actually undertaken on behalf of the panel by UN agencies and NGOs, really show a variety of responses. In emergency settings, we see really that the basic physical protection is still really on top. But what was really interesting is many IDPs who mentioned the issue of livelihoods, like the issue of having a job, of being able to sustain themselves was really, really high up in the responses. And something which also came up very strongly among youth IDPs, because many young IDPs were also consulted, was really the issue of education, and not just primary education, but also secondary and university education. Which came out as very, very strongly, and also job training. So this idea of having a future and of having a future really, it was very important in those discussions. We're actually finalizing the report for all these consultations, and it will be put online on the panel's website. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And we have a question also from Agnes Nicolescu and Myitkyina. So Agnes, would you like to just, I know your question's in the chat, but you can share it with us verbally if you wish. Okay, let me read it then. So Agnes Nicolescu is asking, and I think the question is for Ibere. How do you see the impact of not considering secure tenure in humanitarian responses? What's the impact of not considering land tenure, secure tenure?
There's several impacts. So thanks for the question. There's several impacts. One of them is provoking further displacement, right? So let's say if you don't do a tenure verification, for example, before you build shelters for the displaced, you might build the shelters on lands that don't belong to the people or that you have no authorization to build on, and then these affected persons that have already been displaced are probably going to be displaced again, or suffer violence from the claimants, from the people that claim to be owners of that land. So that's one example of what can happen if you don't deal with that land and property issues. The other, another example that I can give is if you don't understand the history and how land is dealt with in the community where you were working, and if the land has to do with the conflict where you were working. So you might be working in a community where a whole ethnicity has been sort of replaced by other, and if you decide to consult the authorities there, the authorities will probably be biased because they will not account for the interest of the population that has been displaced. So there are several consequences, and not only on I'm speaking from mostly on the shelter side, but also on peace building as well, and even on CCCM and WASH issues. If you need to be able to verify tenure and to secure tenure in order to do any work on land that you can, if you're building a well, if you're building wash facilities, or if you are building houses, all that needs to be preceded by a work of verification.
So thank you so much. We just have one quick question we've got 2 minutes before we need to get to the next presenter. But Mark, can you quickly ask your question? And we have a very brief response, please. Over to you, Mark. I don't hear you. Maybe you have your microphone off. Okay, I don't hear it. So Mark, maybe you can, if you're there and you want to ask your question, please put it on the chat, and then we'll move to the next presenter. But thank you very much, Ibere, for this presentation, and also to the previous speakers. Please do keep your questions coming on chat. And if the presenters can keep an eye on that and respond to what's coming up, that would be great. So ISIS works at the Joint IDP Profiling Service. I've seen very impressive work that they've done on profiling IDPs in cities. So over to you, Isis, to talk a bit more about the work of JIPS.
Okay. Thank you very much, David, for the introduction. I'll just share my screen now. Sorry, I can't find the option to share my screen.
Isis, I believe you should have the rights right now. Maybe just wait for 1 more minute.
Okay.
Are you able to see the share at the bottom of
yes,
the
screen? It's blocked, unfortunately. Okay, I'll just grant it permit. Just 1 moment.
No problem. Hi, David. May I suggest while we work out this issue, there are 3 more questions on the screen.
Please go ahead. Yes.
These are from the Q&As.
Okay. So Greta, maybe you can respond to the one from Sarah on the IDP panel on climate displacement.
Sorry, David, can you just read that one because I'm
okay, yeah, sorry. The question is, do you expect that the IDP panel, to address climate displacement in its recommendations?
Thank you very much for reading it. Indeed, the issue of the impact of climate change is also part of the terms of reference of the panel. So it has to look both at situations of conflict and violence, but also at situations of disasters, including the impact of climate change, or situations where actually all these factors intersect, as we see, for example, in the Sahel and other regions. So for sure. Thank you.
Thanks. And if I may just quickly ask another question. This one's from Rick Fernandez, and I want to put that question to Lloyd, to Scott, sorry. Can you describe how are IDPs tracked once they're in informal settlements?
Well, they're not tracked as such. I mean, I think the work which is giving us data on IDPs and informal settlements generally comes from actors in the field who are providing protection and other services for IDPs. So we collect that data, and again, we have to be talking about, we're not tracking people in that sense, we're tracking cases of displacement. So someone may be displaced more than once, it's a displacement case, and that's something which we are tracking. So we monitor basically the movements of people forth from their homes. So we're not necessarily tracking them, what they're doing and where they're going. It would be nice, but I think it's not always necessary. There are other agencies who can take over from that point. But the data we have generally comes from those who are working in the field. It comes from UN Habitat, it comes from GIPS. That helps us at least understand better the figures that we are getting from, help us triangulate those figures that we get from the government. So I hope that answers your question.
Great. Thanks, Scott. That's good response. Isis, any luck with the presentation yet?
Sorry, I am going to pass you the presenter's right again. You should be able to do it right now.
Yes, now it's allowing me. Thank you very much. I'll just share it in 1 minute. And apologies for that. I hope we didn't waste too much time. Can you all hear me?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. It's great to be here. I'm always very happy that internal displacement gets the spotlight, especially when we're discussing urban issues. So thank you for the invitation. I'm going to be discussing GIP's work in urban areas, particularly building evidence on internal displacement, precisely to inform response and to help internally displaced persons reach a solution in terms of their displacement. I'm going to offer you reflections from our work in Darfur, Sudan. I also have some slides from the work we're doing in Central America, which is actually a very interesting case because it's specific to intra-urban displacement, something that we don't talk about that much, and it's actually very under-researched in a way. However, because of time limits, I might not be able to discuss Central America, but I will keep the slides in case someone is interested and can ask questions at the end. So I'm the head of field support and capacity building at GIPS. Very quickly, we are an interagency service, and with that I mean that we were created and are governed by a combination of UN agencies, NGOs, and the Special Rapporteur for the Human Rights of IDPs, all working, of course, to respond and support IDPs in different contexts. Our specific job is to enable governments, humanitarian and development partners to jointly produce evidence on internal displacement. And I'm going to go deeper into why we promote that joint production of evidence, specifically in internal displacement context. We have 3 key areas of work, and one of them, as you see in the screen, is urban displacement. But of course, the 3 are very much connected in terms of durable solutions, urban displacement, and government capacity building. We're currently supporting 7 countries at the moment during this year, and those include Sudan, that I'm going to discuss now, but as well, very soon we're starting in Burkina Faso, and we're just finalizing in Ukraine. And we have been also very active in Central America, before in Honduras, which was the case that unfortunately I cannot discuss today, and in El Salvador, and now also in Guatemala and in Mexico, in North America. So in terms of the way that the methods and methodology approach that we use to build evidence, it's mostly based on urban profiling. And in this case, in Darfur, Sudan, it's an urban profiling that aims to inform planning and programming for durable solutions to internal displacement. So why urban profiling was needed specifically in Darfur, and specifically in this town called El Fasher in North Darfur? Well, it's precisely a context where after 15 years of protracted displacement, we can really see now how internal displacement is meeting also this very rapid rates of urbanization. And it's interesting to see what happens after so many years, how these two come together, and also how they really illustrate how internal displacement cannot be addressed only through humanitarian means. It needs to be a joint effort of governments, first of all, and then humanitarian development actors. And in the case of Darfur, also with a very strong component of peace building. So at this time, when we started working in Sudan 2 years ago, there were 1 million IDPs displaced in the 5 states of Darfur, and the great majority of them were living in camps. At that time, some of those camps were not necessarily part of urban areas, but with urbanization, they reached a point where many of these camps became peri-urban areas. At this point, there was no evidence of how long-term humanitarian assistance had been or not supporting IDPs to progress or reach a durable solution. So after 15 years, how can we measure, how can we understand if IDPs not only have been assisted in terms of their basic needs, but also supported towards some dignified life and also progress to the solution that they want to see for themselves. It was also important to inform long-term planning, especially with governments and bringing also development and peace-building actors. And as I said before, it was important that this was done together from the very moment that data was starting to be collected. So who was involved? Just very quickly for you to see the wide range of stakeholders involved in very different roles. In this case, for the urban analysis, for example, we partnered with UN Habitat, working closely with the Ministry of Planning, also to understand more HLP issues, while we work with UNDP for more the peace-building aspects, and with UNHCR for protection issues as well. So as you see here, both different levels of government were involved, both at Khartoum level, national level, but also at the state level. Specifically in North Darfur. This was important to anchor the data and then the eventual response also on policy at national level, and also on strategies, local development strategies at El Fasher level. Now, what was the urban profiling informing? Primarily, it aimed to inform plans of the local authorities to locally integrated to IDP camps. As you see here, and this is also interesting for us as urbanists, these are the 2 camps that you see here, Abu Shuk and El Salam. And as I said before, 15 years ago, they were not necessarily connected, at least in the urban fabric of El Fasher, but eventually they become very much part of the city, or at least in theory, or in some physical form. And as you see here, IDPs mostly remain within the camps, although some of them did move into the peri-urban areas, but the majority remain in the camps. So we wanted that whatever upgrading or project led by local authorities that it would be informed by sound evidence, and evidence that was especially accepted by the local authorities, but also endorsed by the humanitarian development actors and other local NGOs also working in the area. It was also important to inform programming and more generally for informing humanitarian development and peace building nexus programming. This was also a pilot, and it's something that we already concluded, we already assessed and externally evaluated, and we're now, just to mention that now, we are doing the same approach in 7 states in Sudan, 5 of them in Darfur, and then also in the Blue Nile and South Kordofan. Just for you to see also the approach that we take for urban profiling, particularly in GIPs. For us, it's quite important that we not only look at data coming from the population, so to understand their needs, their displacement history, and their intentions, but also that we overlay that data with the spatial data and data also about the absorption capacity of the town, especially if we're looking at a displaced population that the majority wants to remain and locally integrate. And I think you heard that from Greta and others today speaking, that this is quite a big trend. People in the end, when they come to cities, most of them intend to stay and locally integrate over time. So the approach that we take is that it's a comparative approach, both at the population level and also at the area level, something that also Daphne mentioned before. We look at a comparison between IDPs and their host communities. And this is important because IDPs sometimes share the same challenges as host communities, and those usually are more development-oriented challenges. But they also share individual challenges related to discrimination specific to displacement, and those sometimes are very difficult to assess and to identify. So this is why we compare the two populations and try to identify which are the ones that are not shared with host populations, and then understand if that is linked to their condition of internally displaced. The other comparative approach we use is across areas. If you see here, there's a core urban area and the peri-urban, and then the 2 IDP camps. And what was interesting here as part of the findings is that, for example, in terms of some of the services, peri-urban, people living in peri-urban areas were doing worse than people in the IDP camps. And I'm saying this just for certain services. But this was very important. It has policy implications and it has programmatic implications, and also implications for how the local authorities need to address issues, not only for IDPs, but also for the host communities, particularly those that were living in peri-urban areas and that were worse than IDP camps. Also considering that IDP camps were benefiting from humanitarian assistance, particularly for water infrastructure and so on, for many, many years. So this is important as well for how we plan the city and how we plan improvements for the city as a whole. And then finally, we overlay that with an urban analysis study for which we partner with UN Habitat, and also with a capacity needs assessment, working with the local authority to understand how they themselves would be able to take over some of the recommendations emerging from the study. So this is what I was mentioning before, in terms of what the urban analysis looked at: availability and use of land, expansion plans and environmental considerations, as well as the absorption capacity of services and infrastructure. This was especially important for any plans for local integration. And another point that I want to emphasize here is that we couldn't do this alone. It was extremely important to build on the local knowledge and expertise from the local authorities and partner with development actors, in this case UN Habitat, to do this work as well as the capacity needs assessment. And finally, as well as part of the methodology, our key expertise within GIPS is how to establish and especially sustain collaboration across this technical process. It is very technical, it is about data collection, so there is a specific soft skills that we need in order to involve all kinds of audiences with different levels of data literacy in an analysis of the context. So this is just a bit of examples of how we engage government officials in the joint analysis of the sectoral findings in order to also help them interpret the results, which were complex in nature, but also localize it to the context in Darfur. So just to show you very quickly, the type of results that emerge are both comparative by population, as I mentioned before, by sector and by area. And you see here already some of the key differences between the camps, peri-urban and urban. This is specific to water. And it also gives us finding intersectoral results. In this case, it was focusing on economic obstacles to access certain services, and then again comparing across populations, and then comparing also across areas. It was also interesting to see that there were differences, sometimes even between the camps. These were people that were coming from different villages and different states in Darfur. And in the end, what we create with this is a baseline to measure progress towards solutions. In this way, all the actors, humanitarian, peace building, development actors, and especially national and local governments, can actually measure how their interventions, future interventions, are helping IDPs progress or not to the solution of their choice. And finally, urban planning considerations were extremely important, and those findings, especially environmental considerations, were especially important for interim solutions and also for long-term integration in the city. So just very quickly, urban profiling, not only here, but also in other contexts where we have done this, specifically in Iraq, most recently in Syria as well. It's a powerful tool to inform joint action, but it needs to involve the key relevant stakeholders from the very beginning in order for that data to be actionable by everyone. So some of the other speakers have mentioned, it's extremely important to locally anchor both the data and then the response for long-term sustainability, and also for incentivizing political action. In this case of Darfur, local authorities could have easily made decisions in terms of upgrading the camps without really understanding what IDPs needed, and also without understanding, crucially, the tensions with host communities. So this type of data informs a more integrated and inclusive approach to responding to internal displacement in urban areas. Again, analysis of people in places is crucial. We can't just look at people or IDPs. We need to look at the host communities and then the context that provides the places where people interact and live. And this is extremely important, especially also for long-term planning and solutions. I think I'll stop here. We can go into some of these recommendations later on. As I mentioned before, I have brought also this case, which is quite interesting because it's intra-urban and it's also from my own country. I'm from Honduras. But unfortunately, because of time, I cannot go into this. But I encourage you to reach out. I'll be happy to discuss for those interested in the Central American region and also on intra-urban displacement. So thank you very much, Daphne, and everyone.
Thanks so much, Isis. And even one of my colleagues is asking if you can share your presentation, particularly on the work in Central America. So maybe you can make that available. We can circulate that. And if there's time, even we could have a look at that towards the end of this, if we do have time. We also have a question up from Mark related to how best to work with local authorities at an early stage and to support integration at an early stage instead of allowing informality to persist and then try to deal with the problem later. So I would be very grateful if some of the panelists or even some of the audience here can respond to that important question. But thanks very much, Isis. And one thing I really appreciated actually is quite a short comment that you made, is that you actually involve national authorities as well, because quite often we then fall into the trap of thinking it's about municipalities. But, to work with cities, IDPs and cities, we have to work with municipalities. Of course, we absolutely have to do that, but also we have to understand that a lot of the services are actually provided by national or regional authorities. So it's very important that this profiling is involving national authorities as one of the stakeholders. Thanks for the very rich presentation, and it just helps us to understand exactly how complex it is when we're working in cities and how a system of spatial data and multi-sectoral data is so important to really understand what we're working with. Muslim Kasimi works with UN Habitat, I used to work in the Regional Office for Arab States, and very proud of this work of HLP rights in Iraq, and Muslim leads that work now. And over to you to talk about how Habitat's working with HLP rights in Iraq. Over to you, Muslim. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, David. Just to confirm, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. As David mentioned, yes, my name is Myitkyina, and I work as a housing, land, and property rights subcluster for Iraq under Humanitarian Response, and also program manager with UN Habitat. Today, I'm going to present a case on how we are practically supporting IDPs and particularly minorities' land rights in Iraq. Just before we go ahead, I just want to give a bit of background about the aftermath of conflict in Iraq. As you may know, during the 2014 and 17, there were around 5.8 million civilians were displaced in Iraq, and now it's still 1.2 million are IDPs in Iraq haven't been able to return to their home. Moreover, more than 138,000 people, private houses has been destroyed, and if we convert this in financial aspect, it's around 16 billion damages only in housing sector in Iraq, and that leads also to large scales of property damages, acute shortage on affordable and adequate housing, widespread illegal and secondary occupation, loss of destruction of ownership documentation and outdated deeds, which is also very important to address. Discrimination against women and minorities is very evident in Iraq. Insecure tenure, unresolved property disputes, it's still ongoing. And list goes on, but I don't want to mention here is the governorates which are most affected. And as you may know, Ninoa or Mosul, maybe you heard of, it's more than 60.27% damaged in terms of housing and property rights. And also, let's go now how UN Habitat is addressing HLP rights and how we are coping with the situation on housing, land, and property. Well, we have two approaches and two ways how we support housing, land, and property. First is about through HLP subcluster. We chair the cluster, and mostly we provide leadership and guidance on HLP issues to national and international actors in Iraq, provide strategic advice, and also issues different guidelines in order to support HLP actors and non-HLP actors on how to mainstream and address HLP in every programming, despite the fact whether it is a humanitarian response, whether it is development, stabilization, including durable solution. We have managed to involve our actors, and also we have been contributing in every field of response in Iraq to make sure that HLP is one of the top priorities for programming and supporting IDPs. The other side, UN Habitat also implement different programs in housing, land, and property, and the one we are going to discuss is about another specific case, which is apart from the high needs, let's say, and IDPs facing different HLP issues, there is another layer of problems, or maybe a discrimination that is going on for centuries in Iraq, where minorities haven't been able to register their ownership rights in Iraq, but which we're going to speak very often now. So particularly we are talking about Yazidi minority. I'm sure many of you who have read about conflict in Iraq, you may notice that there was atrocities, there was genocide declared by UN against this minority. Going back, this problem is not only during ISIL time, but this problem is backdated since 70, when Ba'ath regime or Saddam's regime enforced Arabization in the minorities area. And what they've done is that they forcibly evicted Yazidi minority from original lands in the mountains and brought them in townships, which is called in Arabic mujamma'ats. However, despite the fact that they were forcibly evicted, their properties were destroyed in the original location. When they have been forcibly moved to these townships, again, Saddam's regime did not recognize any property rights for them, did not issue any documentation that relates them with the new land, or did not provide any services or any, let's say, document that can prove that they are existing or are related with their land. UN Habitat is implementing a project particularly to support this Yazidi minority, and with their aim of the project is to support IDPs to return to their area of origin aftermath of ISIL. However, we have two approaches which we are using for Yazidis case. One is with dealing with unresolved claims in Sinjar and advocacy on how to grant HLP rights for Yazidis. As I said, we needed to come up with a very unique approach on how to document and how to make sure that people are aware about the existence of these people. As I said, for centuries they were living there. Nobody even recognized or related them with the land of property, and they were absolutely having no security of tenure. Whoever wanted to evict on 70th evicted them. Now ISIL even became worse because they destroyed more than 6,000 of the houses only in Sinjar, let's say wiping out completely their properties. And it was intentionally done so they can be evicted from their area of origin or from new area, and they will not to be back ever. However, we needed to come up with a very unique approach on starting from the ground and documenting the properties that were they using for centuries, and also arguing that they were always living in these areas. So what we come up, we start mapping and digitalizing the collection of HLP claims and developing databases with the use of mobile technologies. And as you may see here, we have been plotting the demarcation of the land and also verifying and endorsement of the all HLP rights that were registered from the, let's say, households through our approach. And of course, as you may know, we will be using STDM, which is a very, very supportive tool in terms of tenure rights and also recognition of informal rights, recording history of parcel, vectorizing boundaries, and generate also the reports so they can have kind of documentation that they have registered their claim rights and ownership documentation. And as you may see here, we have been piloting for the first time in Iraq STDM tool, where we have been plotting the entire villages and registering the claims of the people and of the property to our databases. And this is around 11 villages, which we have so far. We have registered more than 6,000 claims for the housing, land, and property. And of course, all these claims, plotting, and demarcations of the land are completely with a very new technology, which we have provided and used for the first time ever in Iraq. And of course, it has a land codes, it has a GIS web-based maps, and what is most important, that every plot has a unique code. Every property has a unique code, and also every claim has a different code. And how we secure their tenure rights, and based on the data that we gather in the field, we make sure that we issue occupancy certificates. As you may see here, we have occupancy certificates where we issue to each household to make sure that their property is related with their name of the family members and also with the family and the land. However, we have also brought another layer of problem in Iraq, which we made sure to secure tenure rights for women, also where we have been registering husband and wife as a co-owner for the first time in Iraq. Despite for that, we also have been registering the family members, whether they are girls or young boys, also as a family member in the occupancy certificate, in order to make sure that there is no discriminatory practices and not discriminating anyone from their housing, land, and property. What is also most important to emphasize here, that with this occupancy certificate, all the certificates and also the approach we are using and the methodology and the strategy we are using to secure tenure rights for Yazidis has been endorsed by federal authorities, which they also sign in the document. It is also signed by the community leaders to verify the claim and the validation of the data. And also, the most important is the federal authorities in the government in central level also has endorsed this certificates to be issued by UNHabitat to register Yazidis' property rights. Then this is the work what we are doing in the field and how we are registering property rights of Yazidis. And also, as I said, we have been bringing from the where they were non-existent. Now we are bringing their property rights and their property rights with the latest technology. However, this was not sufficient. It needed another layer of approach, let's say, on how to advocate for Yazidis' rights, because the government in Iraq changes very often, and whoever comes, they absolutely have no idea. Even, let's say, I'm not naming persons, but very high officials mentioned that they had no idea that Yazidis never had any property rights. So UN Habitat has conducted a detailed assessment and also a study how to support property rights of Yazidis, and highlighting how the lack of security of tenure is affecting the prospects of return, and how they are banned and also discriminated to access compensation scheme available in Iraq for their properties that has been destroyed by ISIL, and also how the disputes are affecting the restitution mechanism in Sinjar. We have submitted this study to the government of Iraq, and this has been welcomed very well, because apparently, as I said, they were not so knowledgeable on their minorities' property right discrimination. We have been also drafting a legal decree together with Prime Minister.
I'm going to have to ask you to bring it to a close quite soon.
Yes, 3 minutes and we'll be done.
Well,
and
maybe
we also,
that's possible.
Okay, great. Then we have also we have jointly drafted the legal decree to make sure that we also protect legally their HLP rights, and we have submitted this legal decree to Prime Minister Office and Council of Ministers to endorse this decree. We have been also signing different MOUs, so the government of Iraq is ensured that this strategy to protect HLP rights for Yazidis is also in line with their legal framework, and we have signed an MOU on facilitating registration of HLP rights. Of course, capacity development on HLP and CDM we have been doing for almost 3 years, because in Iraq is let's say everything is paper-based. They don't have any official system on how land administration system and also management of HLP registers. So we've been presenting to them STDM tool to see if they can incorporate in their system. We have done some progress on this. And of course, dispute resolution, we have been training younger generation on how to mediate and resolve property dispute. And awareness raising was one of the main important issues, so we can also particularly increase the awareness to the women to know about the HLP rights. And so far we have managed to issue more than 6,400 certificates to Yazidi minorities in Iraq. Over to you, David. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much. This is amazing, Muslim. And I think this is such a great example of this kind of nexus, because on one hand, using technology to be able to get the early stages, even looking at people's housing land rights while they're even in their camps. And then I think what was very important is the role of advocacy then, and being able to continue this work throughout successive changes of administration. But I think what was really great is actually bringing about change, bringing about those gender rights, bringing HLP more into a better understanding of HLP into systems, and then bringing that dispute resolution, which really sets the floor then for a more sustainable future and a more conflict-free future. So thanks for that amazing presentation. And lastly, we have here Ms. Ivan Calabria, and she works at Oxford University as a senior research officer, and that work with focusing mainly on, I understand, the issue of displacement, and currently working with Cities Alliance with their work in Uganda and other places. So let's look forward to hearing from you. The floor is yours, Ivan.
Hey, Tilo, nice to be with you all. I'm assuming you can hear me. Someone say something if not.
We can hear you well.
Wonderful. Okay. So I'm going to quickly be sharing some research from Ethiopia, where for the past, year, but there was kind of an 8-month intensive study. We were looking at IDPs in Adama. So in a small city about, you know what? Now I need to know how to change. Oh, there we go. Okay, I will click and get to the next slide. A small city about an hour and a half away from Addis Ababa, the capital. And this is what I think of as a really unrecognized success effort in terms of the initial response to IDPs. So in 2018, over 1,300 households were brought to Adama through a centrally delivered lottery system where IDPs were distributed to 11 different cities from camps, and arrived in Adama, obviously without assets, many without contacts, and really quickly received housing, received a school, received very initial emergency support. And there was a really powerful assistance effort that was initially centrally led in the sense of this kind of resettlement happening, and then was taken up by the regional government of Oromia and really furthered through the municipal government. So we saw a sort of cascading effort of assistance that meant that people were really had their, many of them had their needs met initially. And what we see, and probably what none of you would be surprised by, is this ongoing gap now. So over 2 years on from sort of the initial conflict and resettlement, high unemployment, some land disputes, a lot of IDPs talked about a struggle to integrate. And it sort of brings up a question of, what worked initially, and then what do we do now farther on? So as I said, there was this pretty impressive cascading support that meant that through social media, through television, newspapers and networks, there was a real awareness that people had arrived in Adama, that they needed help. And there were 3 resettlement sites that were built. So donations were collected. The private sector was really tapped and offered a lot of support, in-kind assistance, money, and so on. And there was also a pretty incredible kind of informal community response that was building on some of the kind of normal cultural and social mechanisms for giving, for supporting through IDRESSING, different kind of informal groups that offer social support came forward to offer donations or to cook for people and so on. So a really interesting kind of building on what people often do for themselves in their own neighborhoods or in their own family circles being extended. And once these resettlement sites were built, IDPs themselves have also really stepped up to help each other, that they've created their own social, kind of formal social networks to loan each other money and so on. But challenges remain. And so it brings me to a question I'd say is pretty ongoing in this research of, how can the successes in the emergency phase really be harnessed and furthered in, development phase? And I very consciously use quotes for both of these. Of there's that blurring, and each of these can be really interrogated as concepts and as phases and so on. But as I said, sort of the social and cultural mechanisms that initially really did work, I'd say that people learned about the issues through their own networks. And then helped through their own networks. So IDPs talked with us about increasing these platforms for connection, that some of the informal savings groups, could they be extended to IDPs? So could hosts and IDPs be working together? Could the municipal government offer some of these more formal platforms through talks or through sharing in different ways, that could be kind of officially administered, but also sort of socially, bringing people together in a more informal way? And then, this is really building on some of these other really amazing presentations we've heard today of sort of who's here, counting the IDPs, that there's a real lack of information on the number of IDPs in Adama. So there was a very official number that was brought through this lottery system, and it was very clear that there were many unregistered people that also arrived. And now it's unclear sort of who has stayed, what are the needs. What we see is that the people that were registered came with, received identity cards, received a house once it was built, and really were able to access a lot more services than other unregistered IDPs. So there being a real recognition of the importance of registration of documents, which we know that over 1 billion people in the world lack identity documents, and just the impact that can have for citizens as well as, refugees and others that are actually coming into a country. But it obviously matters for IDPs as well. And then also this concept of integration, which was also touched on. I think there's a real need to really understand through micro research into, social dynamics and so on, of what does integration mean? And I say that also very consciously. I'm a labor migrant. I live in the UK. You can tell by my accent, I'm American. I wouldn't really say I'm integrated in the UK, although I've lived there 8 years, that we have this concept of sort of the shared knowledge or characteristics that means that integration happens. And I think, we see that that doesn't happen, and IDPs are kind of an example of that. And I think the housing that we saw discussed in other presentations of where settlements are has a real impact on that, and so on. So there's a lot of different aspects that I think more is needed. And I come from a refugee studies background where integration is kind of at the forefront of discussion. And it's clear that that really matters in the IDP realm as well. So very conscious of time, I will pass it back to the moderator. There's some different kind of readings and documents I'm happy to share. At later points, we're about to launch a case study report and sort of a policy brief attached to this research. So I'd be happy to pass that on to anyone interested and obviously share more at a later point as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much. Sorry you had to rush, but I appreciate it very much. And we will circulate those materials so we can do a deeper dive and understand more about your research work. And I think what's really important there is trying to understand how people are coping and how host communities are supporting and building on that. And in each location, there may be a different way that is being done. And I do think, as in both humanitarian and development, we need to be looking at how communities are dealing with the issue and how they can be supported to strengthen what they're already doing. And I think that this is great. We've probably got time for one urgent question. So if you the first come, first serve, just hit the mic and give your question. And we've probably just got time for like one, and then I'll try and wrap up.
David, there are some questions on the slide. So we've got one question from Mark. Before it is maybe over to you if you can see it.
Great. So this is the question about supporting local authorities from early on, instead of a situation where years and years go by while waiting for returns to become viable. So who can answer this one then? We're talking about the situation in Myitkyina. Do we have a response on this one?
I think. Oh, yes.
No, go for it.
Yes, I think. I mean, I can bring more the data perspective, both in terms of at the micro level, and I think for us it has been crucial whenever we are working in urban areas to definitely reach out to local authorities and try for them to be one of the key actors involved from the very beginning. I think, especially from humanitarian actors and development actors, sometimes we reach out to them when we are already not implementing the programs, or when we already have an idea of what we want to do. But I think we need to reach out to local authorities from the very moment that we're going to start working on internal displacement in an urban area. I think if you get them on board from the very moment that you're building the evidence, you run less chances that they will be against whatever you're proposing or be against discussions on local integration. We need to accept and very much recognize that this is both when you're working in urban areas, it's not just about a technical challenge, it's very much political, especially when you're talking about internal displacement. So if you are intending to engage properly in discussions with local authorities, it's very much important that you do that from the very beginning. You will have to deal with probably with misconceptions about IDPs. Especially in Myitkyina, for Mark, when we worked in Myitkyina 5 years ago, this was a huge issue, the misconceptions around IDPs. Some of the local authorities even thought that IDPs were doing better than other, for example, economic migrants or other people living in informal settlements. So to build that evidence together with the local authorities already gives you a kind of a step in the right direction to help dispel some of those misconceptions around IDPs, especially when you're dealing with informal settlements and urban areas that are already challenged by widespread poverty and so on. So that would be my recommendation. And I think the case of Myitkyina also is quite a good one. By involving the Benadir administration, actually it empowered them also to, first of all, set up a task force. And now, 4 years later, they are a municipality that have their own local strategy for durable solutions.
Thanks so much for this. And maybe we just go to the question also from Rick Fernandez to Muslim about the, has adverse possession of land and property been an issue? He's relating to a situation in Bosnia, but has it been the same in the north of Iraq?
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, I'm also aware of the Bosnian context. I'm from Balkan. In Kosovo also was the same case, same like in Bosnia, and I work with UNHPD on the time to restitute property rights in Bosnia and Kosovo. However, I think in Iraq here it's completely different context. And we don't have any issue with the adverse possession. And there's also another thing to highlight, that usually the community in between, they don't occupy illegally their each of anyone properties and lands. And also this made us very easy to do our work and to register the property rights. As I said, also we also do the verification, but that we did not face any issue in Sinjar. Over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Muslim, for this concise response. I'd love to be able to open the floor for further discussion, but I'm afraid we're going to need to bring it to a close. I'd like to introduce Brigitte from Cities Alliance, who coordinates the migration and displacement work of the Cities Alliance. Maybe I can ask you to put some closing remarks, Brigitte.
That is Florence. I'm here on behalf of Brigitte today.
Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. So really for some closing words, I would like to, of course, thank you, UN Habitat, to invite us to co-host this webinar series. It was very interesting, and it was, we learned so much from showing how the cities was put at the center of the picture here. I will be very brief as a matter of time. I wanted to thank all the speakers for flagging the role of the municipalities, the fact that local integration is really, really important, and also the fact that all communities can be worse off and that we always need to draw attention on them. So Cities Alliance, with the Genre Program on Citizen Migration, will keep advocate for more technical and financial support to secondary cities. We hope to do that with our partners and our members, and we thank the City Development Corporation for the financial support. Thank you, Daifel.
Thank you so much. And I think this has been a very, very fascinating discussion. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much, Florence, Brigitte, and Stephanie for organizing, Stephanie with Habitat, and Florence and Brigitte from Cities Alliance for putting this together. But mainly also thank you to these great speakers. I think we've heard some great examples of the work in displacement being something that really sits in this humanitarian development nexus. We've heard that the need for new instruments, the need for new perspectives. With Cities Alliance here, we see the importance, as mentioned in Bangladesh, of secondary cities and potential for this. I think this is something that needs to be explored more. Can cities be prepared in advance, even for situations of displacement, as we get increasing climate displacement taking place, but also how this is feeding the policy discussion. And I'm extremely happy to hear from Greta how the high-level panel is really taking the issue of municipalities seriously and engaging a lot in that discussion. That's great. I think there's a lot of work to be done, particularly in the areas of data, but a lot of work is being done. And we've heard fantastic tools being shared today around data, around HLP rights, etc. So thank you so much. I've learned a lot, and I hope others have in the room. Thank you. And again, thanks to Cities Alliance for organizing this. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.